G'day guys, Jazz here and welcome to the video, and in particular welcome to my first ever video. Now I'm a consultant radiologist based in Australia. Now I know what you're all thinking, Jazz, Australia? Yes, so I'm going to answer a few questions straight off the bat for you. No, I do not ride a kangaroo to work every day. Yes, there are currently shrimp on my barbie. And yes, the weather is currently amazing outside. So guys, as I mentioned before, I'm a consultant radiologist based in Australia, or the same as an attending for my American friends. So in today's video, I thought I would talk about the process in order to become a radiologist in Australia, the various exams and hurdles I've faced along the way, and my overall thoughts on the process. So let's take it back to 2009, which is when I first started medical school. So most medical schools in Australia are undergraduate programs, meaning that you essentially apply for entry straight from high school. Now my program was 5 years in length, essentially split into a preclinical and clinical kind of thing like most undergraduate programs are. Now I won't lie, I miss my medical school days. They were probably the most fun and enjoyable times I've had. And as a radiologist, I'd have to say I don't break bad news very often, but I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube about medical students kind of going on about the hundreds of hours that they spend studying for their medical school exams. But I hate to tell you all, and I say this in the nicest possible way, but wait till you get to your specialist exams. Now, in the final year of medical school, you essentially, apart from having to complete your final exams and whatnot, you've also got to start thinking about your internship, which is your first working year, and there's an application process for all that as well. Now, the main kind of things to consider essentially when you're applying for your internship really is what city do you want to live in, and and that can usually be related to friends and family, where they're going or where they live. A lot of people in Australia move interstate to study medicine, and most people want to go home and back to their families after medical school finishes. But then also the other thing to consider is, do you want to go to a big hospital or a small hospital? And essentially both have pros and cons, which I'll go into later. But the application process itself happens about halfway during the final year of medical school, and it's essentially a ballot system where all medical students will put in a preference for where they want to go. And there's usually each state will have about 14 hospitals or something like that, and you preference them 1, 2, 3 to 14. And then you're usually have the best chance of getting your highest preference in the state that you did medical school. Now, if I'm wrong and the process has changed, let me know in the comments, but that's what it was like when I applied, all those years back. Your internship year is still considered a training or assessment year, where you've only obtained provisional registration upon completing medical school. So then that year basically, involves about 5 terms, usually a medical term, a surgical term, emergency medicine term, and then 2 other terms. And then each of those terms you get passed by a supervisor who will assess you during your term, and then essentially you have to pass all 5 in order to make it through the year and then obtain your final general registration, and then you're considered to be a proper doctor. Now, as I was saying before, you can basically choose between a bigger or a smaller hospital for where you want to do your junior medical years. Now, pros and cons wise, and these are just my personal opinions, so the smaller hospitals are usually easier to get into. They have a smaller cohort of junior doctors, and they're usually not in the large central business districts or in the main cities, slightly in the suburbs or peripheries, and they're, I suppose generally most people want to go to the CBD hospitals, so they get preferenced higher. So I would say the pros for those smaller kind of hospitals would be you get a bit more of a hands-on experience. The overall medical staff volume is usually smaller. So the senior consultants, registrars are usually people that have been rotated on peripheral rotations. So essentially not as many people around. If you're a full-time intern or resident in these smaller hospitals, you get to do a lot more things. So you'll get to do more procedures. If you're on a surgical term, the bosses and stuff will probably let you scrub in and help a bit more because they don't have as many training registrars with them on the rotation. And then also on top of that, your paperwork and stuff will also be a bit less because the actual volume of patients in the smaller hospitals, is smaller as expected. And then you have the bigger hospitals, which are like your tertiary and quaternary centres that are usually based in the large cities. So each state will usually have a couple of them in the major city or the capital of the state. And I suppose the benefits for those hospitals are generally the complexity of cases, essentially. So they're usually big specialist centres. All the peripheral hospitals will send their complicated cases to these hospitals. So I suppose your exposure to different types of pathologies and different types of operations and stuff will be significantly higher in these kind of facilities. And then on top of that, there's usually greater academia as well. So you have a lot of each team or whatever will have certain number of professors and whatnot who will do grand rounds and teaching sessions and all that. So your exposure to all this extra teaching from very well renowned specialists it's there. So it's quite a good learning opportunity from that point of view. And also research wise, obviously it's more academic, so there's a lot more research opportunities as well, which you might not get at some of the smaller hospitals. But I suppose the biggest con with the bigger hospitals is that because the volume of patients is so high, there's a lot of training registrars as well. So a lot of the time, the cool things like scrubbing into the theatre or procedures or whatever it is that's generally interesting will kind of be allocated to those more senior staff because there will be like a part of their training requirements or something like that. And then generally when you're a junior staff there, you're essentially a glorified paper pusher. Like that's the truth about it. Like sure, you might every now and again get to do something good, but most of your time will be spent doing paperwork, tons of discharge summaries, getting referrals and whatnot. And that's essentially what you'll spend the majority of your time doing. So I guess that's the major negative of that. And then personally for me, I did decide to go down the big hospital pathway because I knew what specialty I wanted to do straight out of medical school. And I kind of knew that, and this applies to all specialties essentially, is that you have to know where you're going and you have to kind of network with the right people. And obviously, if you're trying to get into a specialty, it's better that you go to a facility for your junior years that actually offers the specialty that you want to do. So a lot of the smaller peripheral centres, like I said, the registrars who are the training specialists actually get allocated from a bigger hospital and they'll get sent out there just to do a rotation and then they'll usually come back to their main base hospital. So obviously all the training stuff is actually at the base, larger hospital. And that's why for me, I was like, all right, I know what I want to do. I need to get in with the right people and, try and get onto research projects and all that. So I decided to go with the major hospital pathway or the, tertiary, quaternary kind of centre. But then again, even with those, you do usually get a rural or peripheral term, which is generally 3 months. So you do get a bit of exposure to like a smaller site as well, which is also good. You finally get through that first year of internship. The main thing in your second year essentially is you kind of have to start thinking about what specialty do I want to do? Now, most people will kind of decide their specialty based on the terms that they've done during their, first 2 years. People will have positive experiences in certain terms where they really got along with the team or, the certain pathologies that they saw were great or, they loved being in theatre, doing whatever types of operations. And I found for myself, although I did know early on that I wanted to do radiology and, the reasons for which I'll talk about in another video, but I guess the main thing was that I also kept an open mind. Like, although I was pretty set on knowing what I wanted to do, I thought, I'll see what other kind of, like what terms I get and what's allocated to me and, keep an open mind and see if there's anything else that I really like. Going through the different specialties, kind of ticking the ones that you do like. And then a lot of the time for most people, it will be kind of eliminating specialties that you don't like. There'll always be certain aspects about, different terms that you've done where you're just kind of like, oh, no, there's no way that I want to do that. Or, for me, like, although I found surgical terms and stuff like that quite interesting, the operations are great. physiology, pathology, all that's quite interesting. But to me, the thought of having to stand in theatre all the time, was a bit of a put off, really. And I remember, like, early on, when I was an intern, actually, I did a urology term. It was actually the first term that I ever did. And I remember walking around with my registrar at the time, absolute legend. I remember he said to me at the time, he was kind of like, Jazz, like, what do you want to do? And I was like, thinking about surgery, or maybe radiology. And he said it straight up to me. He's like, you should just do radiology. He's like, if I hadn't committed so much time to surgery, I would do something else as well. And I was like, okay, well, thanks for letting me know. I guess, maybe I'll second think about doing surgery. And then later on that same day, I went to theatre and still on urology. And one of my bosses there was a pretty new consultant. I think he'd only been a boss for about 2 years. And we had the same kind of conversation. Like, that's kind of a thing when you're an intern. All your bosses will kind of like ask you what you want to do. And generally, they'll try and tell you why their specialty is better than someone else's. And then this guy basically was like, oh, so what do you want to do? And I was like, oh yeah, like urology is pretty good. Like, I'll think about doing that. And he's like, oh mate, don't do that. He's like, do radiology. And I was like, all right. 2 surgeons have told me today that I should do not surgery. Okay, so you've gotten to the stage where you've kind of decided what you want to do. And in Australia, there is essentially each specialty will have its own training college. Like, the radiologists will have the Royal Australian College of Radiology. And you basically have to go through an application process all over again. So, you thought getting into medical school and all that was a hard step, like hard process. And don't get me wrong, it definitely was. But then essentially this is round 2.0. So you basically have to do the same things again. But in this case, you're looking into your CV, which is probably the first thing that they check, essentially. So you apply to the college, they'll want to check your CV, you have to meet certain criteria. So you have to do a certain amount of years of work. Generally, for a lot of specialties, it's complete at least 2 years of working. And then the next step that they'll consider is your CV. So the first 2 years, you've also kind of got to be mindful of trying to boost and beef up your CV, getting ready to prepare for these applications. Now, on your CV, generally you'll do different courses. You go to various conferences. Another big thing is research projects. So, ideally, you want to publish at least a few papers by the time you're applying, and that kind of applies to most specialties that are competitive, I suppose, which is a lot of them these days. There's a lot of junior doctors that are coming through applying to the various training pathways. You do all those things, maximize what you can. Some people do master's degrees, PhDs, if you're trying to get into certain kind of surgical subspecialties. So people will do all that. You kind of maximize your CV. And then on top of that, then it's also your referees that will also be considered. When you're a junior doctor, like, they're going to ask you usually for about, it varies, but somewhere between 3 to 10 referees, depending on where you're applying to. Then when you're a junior doctor, it's hard to find these referees as well, because you've been the junior person in the team. You kind of hide in the shadows, you just get the jobs done, and usually you kind of probably interact with your registrars the most, and they'll kind of do all the jobs and stuff, and then you'll usually just do a ward round with the consultants, or every now and again, if you're in surgery, you might operate with them, or you might go to clinic with one of your bosses, but it's pretty small interactions. So then, and you rotate a lot as well. So, each term is 3 months. So it's not really that long to get to know somebody who's only there some of the time. Being mindful that each team will usually have a handful of consultants, and they all, will work certain days at the public hospital where you are, and then certain days they'll work in private practice where they don't see you. And then you've got to kind of decide, like, who can I use? Like, who would be happy to support me, or who's seen enough of me, or who have I really just spoken enough to that they might remember my name? And because I remember there were certain consultants that, we didn't really interact with much. They would come in, do their rounds and whatever. You just quickly chase behind them, just writing down the notes and whatever. Follow them around like a little puppy dog, and then they'd kind of go. And you're like, all right, well, nice to see you. So then you've got to pick who you want to ask. And like I said, it's a handful of consultants. So it can be a bit hard deciding who to pick. And I think the biggest fear anyone has, like as a junior doctor and asking someone, is like, does this person remember me? Like, if I send him an email, is he just going to be like, who this? Or, it's a possibility. But anyway, I remember asking one of my bosses who I had for my upper GI surgical term as an intern. And this guy was a great guy, really nice guy. And but when I asked him, like it'd been over a year since I'd done the term. So I was really worried. I was like, oh, is this, will he remember me at all? And there's a lot of interns that pass through their team, like every couple of months they rotate. So I was like, I'm not sure he'll remember me, but might as well ask. He told me at the time, at the end of the term, if I needed a referee, just to ask him. And it was actually quite funny. I sent him an email being like, oh, hi, it's Jazz. Do you remember me? I was hoping to get a referee for my application to radiology. It's always obviously best to be upfront with them, even though you're not applying to their specialty, but there still holds a lot of weight what they have to say about you. And I remember his response, actually. It was quite funny. He was just kind of like, hey, Jazz, yeah, I do remember you. He's like, happy to support your application, even though you've decided to pursue a career of sitting in a dark room rather than doing great things in surgery. I was very thankful that he was happy to be my referee. So you've finally gone through all that hard work of, sorting out your CV, sorting out your referees, and then submitting the application on time, hopefully. And then it's a waiting game, really. So you wait around. Generally, they take a couple of like a month or two, basically. And this is just waiting to see if you actually get accepted for an interview. So most of the training programs, it's all very competitive. The number of interview spots is significantly smaller than how many people apply to the program. Then you finally get that email and you're invited to an interview and you're like, yes, I'm almost there. And then you go to the interview and walk into this big room, big long table, at least that's what it was like for me. And I think there was about 10 or 12 consultants like just sitting around the table, and then me sitting on one side of a long table just by myself, and them just all looking at me. So you spend the next, it was like 40 minutes or something like that, just getting grilled left, right and center. Like, there's 10 to 12 people around you, so it's coming from every single direction. And at the time you're thinking, why am I doing this? But I guess you got to do what you got to do. I finally started radiology training in 2016. Obviously very happy about getting accepted. Then that you can finally start progressing with your training and, finally, leading yourself towards becoming a specialist, which is essentially the end goal of this, very, very long game. Radiology training in Australia is 5 years. It's kind of split into phase 1 and phase 2, I believe it's called. Anyway, there's two big hurdles during the 5 years as well. So the first hurdle is what's known as your Part 1 exam, which consists of 4 components. Now, it's 2 anatomy and 2 physics exams, and you have to complete them by the end of your second year of training. Now, yes, you heard me right, that is physics. 2 physics exams, and I don't know about you guys, but I hadn't studied physics since high school, so that was like 9 years ago before or something like that. And I won't lie, I wasn't that good at physics back then anyway. So for me, it was a bit of a hard slog learning all the physics, and then on top of that, all the anatomy as well. And one of our exams is actually just writing anatomy essays. So not that fun. Once you do get through, then you're pretty happy about it. Knowing that you've got a little bit of time before you have to probably start studying for your next set of exams. So, like I said, you have to finish that first 4 exams by the end of your second year. Then the third year, you can focus a bit more on actually learning radiology once you've passed those initial exams. And then you get to the real barrier, which is your Part 2 exams or your fellowship exams, essentially your final exams ever. And you do that usually at the beginning of your 4th year of training. Now, these Part 2 fellowship exams essentially consist of 10 components. Yes, 10. There are 3 written exams and 7 clinical exams. So, and our clinical exams, you're probably thinking, radiologist, like why would you have clinical exams? What does that mean? But our clinical exams are pretty hard, and they're obviously film reading exams. So it's split into 7 subspecialties, like you have, musculoskeletal imaging, abdominal imaging, etc., for 7 different components, including pathology. We have to study pathology too, which I don't know why. But picture this. So our clinical exam, essentially, you walk into a room, you sit down, and there's a light box in front of you. I don't know why a light box. It's not 1970 anymore, but yes, we still read film. And then you've got 2 examiners sitting on either side of you. So it's nice and cozy. They're on either side of you. You've got a thing right in front of you. And they're just putting up films left and right in front of you. And you've got to do that 7 times for 25 minutes each. So it's pretty hard. Because there's such big exams, the pass rate, I think, approximately for passing the 10 exams in the first attempt is about, 17%, which, yes, 17, which is ridiculous. With that much on the line, you basically start studying for these exams about 12 to 18 months before the exams. You're studying for 12 to 18 months on top of working full-time for that same duration. And that's including, evening shifts, night shifts, weekends, all that on top of it. And then you finally do that exam and, you're hoping that you get through all the components in the first go, but, like I said, 17% usually get through it in the first go. So you might have to do it again, and that prolongs your study a bit longer. And then, you're just hoping eventually you'll get through it by the end of 5 years. You've finally finished your training and you'll become a fellow of the College of Radiology. Now you're a fully qualified specialist in radiology. And then that's finally the end of the journey. So for me, that's 13 years. So I guess the main thing is, after 13 years of, just kind of non-stop studying and doing exams and, working weekends and, friends ask me, oh, can you come hang out this time? And I'm me being, no, I've got to work. Do I think it's worth it? Well, yeah, of course. If I didn't think it was worth it, I probably wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Long journey, but I think, anything good in life, takes a lot of effort. Now that I've finally finished, I feel like obviously it was definitely worth it. During the exams and stuff, I probably thought otherwise, but got past that. So now I feel like it was a good journey, good character building session. I'll go into the reasons that I decided to pursue radiology and what I really love about it in another video. But thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.